The Photography Explained podcast is supported by rickmcavoyphotography.com/courses. More at the end. What is the difference between RAW and JPEG formats? Hi, and a very warm welcome to episode 194, blimey, of the utterly splendid Photography Explained podcast. I'm your host, Rick, and in each episode, I will try to explain one photographic thing to you in plain English in less than 27 minutes-ish without the irrelevant details. I'm a professionally qualified photographer based in England with a lifetime of photographic experience, which I share with you in my podcast. Okay, so here is the answery bit. RAW and JPEG are file formats. Photographers use both. JPEG images have an amount of processing and compressing done to them when a photo is taken. RAW photos, however, have no processing done to them other than creating the file, that is. JPEG photos can be viewed by anyone straight off the memory card, but to view RAW photos, you need specialist software. JPEG files are smaller than RAW files, but RAW files contain more data to work with than JPEG files. Right, those are the main differences. But what does this all mean? Does it matter? Why do I need to know this? Well, you do. This is important, okay? So, let me explain. RAW versus JPEG, it's one of those things and it sounds much worse than it is, and by the time you finish this episode, you will fully understand RAW versus JPEG and will know exactly where you stand on this issue and how this affects not only how you take photos, but also your image processing. And you'll see how important the file type that we use is. How utterly splendid. Okay, let's start with some definitions. Well, what does JPEG mean? JPEG is the Joint Photographic Experts Group, a group of good folk who came up with the JPEG format, a standard file format, in the late 1980s, and we still use it today, which should tell you all you need to know in this world of seemingly constant change. Now, that's 1986 to be precise, apparently. I say apparently because I don't remember this happening. This must have been in the early days of digital photography. I certainly had a film camera then, so get on with it, Rick. Now, the JPEG file format can display 16.8 million colours, yet still be a relatively small file size. This is achieved by what is known as lossy compression, which removes visual data that the human eye can't see, and it averages out colours within an image. Now, this might sound bad, but it's not. It's so clever. JPEG photos still look great, and the file sizes are so much smaller than, well, RAW files. And these JPEG files capture the metadata the camera captures when a photo is taken. More on that in a minute, but that was a significant factor in the development of JPEG. JPEG is a wonderful thing, don't get me wrong. But thinking about this, there has to be a loss in image quality just by the very nature of what's going on. But the more important question is, can we actually see the difference? That's the question that really matters. Are there different types of JPEG formats? Well, this is where it can get complicated. There are variations and there are different file extensions other than JPEG, but as far as I'm concerned, JPEG is JPEG. So to answer the question, are there different types of JPEG formats? No is my oversimplified answer to this question, and going into any more detail is not going to help me because in my camera, I've got JPEG and that's it. Right, moving on. What does RAW mean? RAW doesn't stand for anything other than raw. RAW doesn't. It's not an acronym for something, it's just a word, RAW. And it's a word that, unusually for photography, makes perfect sense. So a RAW file is simply a file that has not been processed, other than to create the file, that is. Think of a RAW file like a film negative, and you can think of a JPEG as the print if that helps. Now, I quite like this comparison. I'd never thought of that before, but I discovered this researching this episode. And yes, I do research this stuff, in case you were wondering. No, it's not all off the top of my head. I'm not that clever. So a RAW file is larger than a JPEG file, much larger. And a RAW photo looks rubbish when viewed after import. A raw photo is dull, flat, and lacking in contrast and colour. They look awful, and they are pretty much the reverse of the bright and shiny JPEG. But don't worry, there's lots of data in there to work with, and that is the point. More data to work with than there is in a JPEG file. First time I took photos using RAW, I imported them into Lightroom, and I was appalled. They looked absolutely dreadful. So don't worry, it's all good. Now, using the RAW file format, you've got the opportunity to capture more of the brightest highlights and more of the darkest shadows, which has to be a good thing, doesn't it? Of course it does. Right, so are there different RAW formats? Yes, there are. Canon has Canon RAW with a file extension CR2. Olympus has Olympus RAW with a file extension ORF. Each camera manufacturer that has their own RAW file format probably has their own RAW processing software, which is the thing that you're given when you buy your camera. Now, it's not free, the cost is built into the camera, but once you bought it, you've bought it. Now, shock confession, I have never ever used the camera manufacturer's own processing software, rightly or wrongly, so that's where my knowledge ends on that one, so I need to move on. Right, processing JPEG photos. A JPEG file has been processed and compressed when you take the photo. You can use a JPEG photo straight out of the camera, or you can do further processing yourself, and other people can open JPEGs without you doing any editing to them. But you can't undo what's been done to the file when the photo was taken. What has been done when the image is taken is baked into the file. There is no going back from it. No, there isn't. That is it. You can adjust what's there, but you can't go back to the raw file. I'll explain the difference shortly. So, processing raw photos. Unlike a JPEG, a RAW file has not been processed, so you have to process RAW files yourself from scratch, and that's why they look rubbish. An original RAW file looks rubbish, getting back to the script, before processing, but there's more data to work with, meaning potentially better results. Now, I say potentially better results because it's not a guarantee of better results, but it gives you more stuff to work with. But share a RAW file with someone though, and they certainly won't be able to open it unless they've got specialist software. But JPEGs can be opened by anyone. And share an unedited RAW photo with someone, and if they can open it, they're going to think the photo's rubbish because it looks rubbish. So don't do that. Don't do that ever. I've never shared my RAW files with anybody thinking about it. Apart from when I'm writing to my email subscribers, more on that later, and sending them images to have a player editing. That reminds me, I must do that again. It was great fun and I got a great response. Like I say, I'll come onto my email list later. Okay, a quick word on JPEG presets. There is a whole world of JPEG presets that you can use to get specific looks. For example, Fuji have presets that create JPEG files that look like film photos. Now, I've never used these myself, so this is all I know, but if you like the sound of having presets to take you straight to a different look or style, now you know about it, so you can look into it yourself. And if you do and you get something useful out of it, let me know, because it's not something I've done myself, because I take photos in RAW. I make it hard for myself. File sizes, RAW versus JPEG. RAW files are much larger than JPEG files, so if storage space is an issue and a smaller file size is important to you, you need to remember this. But if you follow my one photo rule, this should not be a problem, should it, dear listener? Check out episode 152 titled How My One Photo Rule Will Help You Take Better Photos. For much more on my one photo rule, not surprisingly. I use external hard drives for my photos, and my Lightroom catalogue, it's on an external hard drive all of its own, so space isn't an issue to me, and at the moment I'm going through the process of deleting all the rubbish photos on my hard drive. More on that in a future episode, would you believe, but yeah, that's what I'm doing. Okay, so how do I edit my photos? Lightroom is my photo editing program of choice. I import all my images, be they from my Canon or Olympus cameras, into Lightroom, and I work on the RAW files in exactly the same way. Well, on the face of it, my processing of them is the same. I'm not aware of any differences, but to be honest with you, I'd never given this a thought until now. So if you've got more than one camera system, don't worry about the different file types, because editing in Lightroom is just fine. And I would imagine the same applies with other editing software, so this shouldn't be a problem. My understanding is a raw file is a raw file, and they appear as data in editing software. If it's a Canon RAW or an Olympus RAW, it's a raw file that needs something doing to it. So, not a problem. Okay, there is another file format, DNG. Now, DNG, it's a universal raw file format which you can select in Lightroom, although I haven't found a reason to yet. DNG is short for digital negative, and the file extension is DNG. Adobe created the specification for this format for others to follow to create a standard raw format. So you have the same as JPEG, which is a universal format. And it's a great idea. And the question is, do you need to do it? And in my case, the answer was no, because I'm fine as I am. And if I'm fine, I'm not changing. Bah humbug. DNG files are smaller than raw image files, and they can load quicker. So that all sounds good, doesn't it? And whilst they are more compatible with other stuff and other users, that's not relevant to me, because all I do is edit my own photos, and, well, I'll tell you why it's not an issue to me shortly. Are there any other file formats? Yes, there are many. I won't list them all here. JPEG and RAW are the most common ones and the only two that I use. Well, okay, actually I use the default file formats from Canon and Olympus, but I work on these files in exactly the same way. And with my Canon camera, I've got two file formats. They are RAW and JPEG. And with my Olympus camera, they are RAW and JPEG. And that's why I say there's only one type of JPEG for me, and there's only one type of RAW. Okay? Not oversimplifying it, that's what my camera presents me with. So who am I to question Canon and Olympus? So why many different formats? No idea. Evolution, I guess. Move on, Rick. We're not bothered, are we? Okay, metadata. I touched on it earlier. What is it? Quick explanation. Metadata is the technical details that a digital camera captures when you take a photo. Things like aperture, shutter speed, ISO, camera body, lens, focal length, image capture mode, file format, time, date, and much, much more. There's so much data, it's absolutely staggering. Basically, it's everything that contributes to what ends up on your camera sensor and more. And it even captures the location if your camera's got a GPS in it or something similar. This info is incredibly useful, and it allows me to look at a photo taken 15 years ago and know what the aperture and shutter speed were. And before I had Lightroom, when I started off in digital photography, I didn't know this, and I used to write down the camera settings for every photo that I took, which is what I used to do back in the film days. Can you imagine that now, writing down all that info for every photo that you take? But having said that, I only take one photo, don't I? So it shouldn't be a problem.
Ready to plug into the future? Join myself, Sean Leahy,
and me, Andrew Maynard,
on Modem Futura, where we explore the technologies shaping our futures.
We bring the experts, the insights, and a whole lot of curiosity to every episode of Modem Futura as we boldly go where no one else has gone.
So join us as we navigate the intersection of innovation and humanity, uncovering the stories that will define our collective futures. Subscribe to Modem Futura wherever you get your podcasts.
We'll see you there.
See you then.
I mean, imagine how useful it is to know all those technical details about something from 15 years ago, especially for someone like me who struggles to remember what I did yesterday. Oh yeah, and both JPEG and RAW, they capture all this good stuff. Right, so that is JPEG and RAW explained. There is lots more I could say, but That's the bits that we need to know. That's the bits we need to understand. And now, in the talky bit, I'm going to move on because there isn't one, because I've already done it. What I want to do is talk about what I do, which will put things together nicely. So what do I do? Well, I take photos with my digital camera in RAW. I edit the photos in RAW in Adobe Lightroom, and then I export the photos out of Lightroom as JPEG files to share and publish. And that's what I do. It is that simple. All I care about is the final image, getting the best image quality that I can. And the editing process is, like I said, it's exactly the same with photos taken with Canon and Olympus cameras. And I think that's the same for all cameras. One downside is I've got the raw photos that I edited, and I've got the JPEGs as well as a separate copy, which is actually stored somewhere else on a different drive. Yeah, the JPEG files are much smaller, but it is a bit of doubling up there. If I didn't have to export the images as JPEGs, if I could just send the raw files out, then I would do, but other people can't open them, and the file sizes are big, so it's just one of those things. So if JPEG works for you, great. It doesn't for me. That's my choice. So now I take the photos in RAW so I can capture the maximum image data. And I want to do the processing myself. I don't want the camera to do the processing for me. I don't want it to make these decisions for me. I want to do it sat in my home office with a nice big calibrated monitor in Lightroom, and I can get consistency in my editing of my photos. Again, the final image is my priority. That is that. Right. Now, with JPEG, you can get the photos straight out of camera and you can chuck them on social media to your heart's content, but I don't do that, so it's not an issue for me. It's not a problem. Okay, that's what I do. What should you do? Well, if you don't like the thought of using the RAW file format, for whatever reason, think about using RAW and JPEG together. This is what I did. Well, I started off actually using JPEG, but as I learned about RAW and as my photography techniques developed, I started to take RAW and JPEG at the same time. See, I knew there were advantages to RAW, but I wasn't confident processing RAW images to start with, but as soon as I started to take RAW photos and I started editing them, I found it just fine. It was absolutely fine. It might sound much worse than it is. It is not that different to editing JPEGs. You're just starting from a different place and you've got more to do, but you've got more to work with to get better results potentially. So if you've got any doubts, but you want to progress with your photography, use RAW and JPEG and plan slowly to move from one to the other. The camera settings don't change, just how the camera captures and records the light on the image sensor. My only regret is I didn't do this sooner in my photographic journey. The first few thousand photos I took with digital cameras, they're JPEG only because I didn't know about RAW. I wish I did because I could do things now that I can't do with those photos, especially from the cameras back in 15, 20 years ago. But you live and learn, don't you? But once I got into the swing of RAW, I stopped taking JPEGs altogether and I deleted the JPEG files where I had RAW ones. I'll come back to that in a future episode because there's another learning there. What do professional photographers do? Now, I've got no doubt there are professional photographers who use the JPEG file format as well as those who use the RAW file format, and that tells you that there's no right or wrong here. It just depends which works best for you, which only you can answer. And obviously I can help you if you want. Feel free to get in touch. Always delighted to hear from listeners. So do I really need to use RAW? No, you don't. And there are those who will say that in 2024 there is no need to use RAW as JPEG is so good you can't tell the difference. And they have a point, but that is up to you. And the only way to find out is to try. I've been shooting in RAW for well over a decade now, and I've got no reason to change. And here's one reason why. White balance. If you're taking photos in RAW and you select auto white balance on your camera, guess what you can do in post-processing? You can select any of the white balance presets available on your camera, and you can change the white balance to any of those presets. So rather than changing while you're taking photos, you can do it after, which is pretty cool, isn't it? And you can't do that with a JPEG. Just saying. So I use auto white balance all the time, which saves me time and hassle when I'm taking photos, because I set the white balance manually when I'm processing my photos. I don't use the presets. I use a neutral grey. That's definitely one for another time. And that works with JPEG and RAW, to be fair. It's just that you've got those presets after the event, which is a pretty awesome thing. Right, what if I use a phone to take photos? It depends what you're going to use the photos for. See, I can take photos in RAW on my phone, but I don't bother as I've got a camera to do that with, and I don't edit photos taken on my phone. Well, very rarely do I. But if your phone's your main camera, you might want to use RAW yourself. The principles of what I said, they apply just the same with cameras in phones. You just need an app that will take RAW photos. Okay, what do? Nope, already covered that. Right. The good, the bad, and what I did once. Yes, really. When I started out using a DSLR camera, I was taking photos in JPEG, and at some point I moved over to RAW and JPEG, and then to RAW. But in the transition from one to the other, I made such a mess of the files, which I can still see in my Lightroom catalogue today. That's being sorted, by the way. I think what happened, I overcomplicated things, and I ended up with a right old mess to sort. And I hadn't got my filing of photos sorted then, so like I say, I had a real mess to deal with. And in writing this, it gave me an idea for the next episode, which is going to be how to organise your photos. Yep, that sounds perfect to me, and that's going to be the perfect follow-on for this episode, and it will help you stop making the mess I did if you're going to go down the road of RAW and JPEG. It'll help you whatever you're doing, because it's one of those things. I didn't know how to organise my photos, and I made a real mess of it. And it cost me a lot of time and lost images, I am pretty sure. Right then, some thoughts from the last episode. I probably should have said in the last episode that it's good practice to keep your sensor clean. Do the things that I told you to do, because they don't cost you anything and it just keeps on top of your sensor. Now, I check my sensor every now and then, and I take test shots every now and then, and this is well worth doing and something that I am now reminded to do more often. And I know I said in the last episode I was going to take the photos which I suggested myself and post them on the podcast website. Have I done that? No, I haven't. I will when I get time. But I am still obsessive with keeping my camera sensors clean. I really am. And it's deeply ingrained in me and my photography, and quite right too. Okie dokie, next episode. Well, this episode was a result of a search when travelling on a train, and the search was, what is the most asked photography question? And this is it. What is the difference between RAW and JPEG photos? Yes, really. And as I said, in completing the writing of this, the next episode appeared right in front of me, which is good. And it will be something about how to organise your photos. Title, to be worked on. Okay, ask me a question. If you've got a question you would like me to answer, just email me, sales@rickmcavoyphotography.co.uk, or visit the podcast website, photographyexplainedpodcast.com/start, or text me from the podcast feed. And if you want to say hi, just say hi. I love hearing from my listeners. Right, I'm done. This episode, like the last episode, it was brought to you by a coffee which I consumed before I settled down in my homemade acoustically cushioned recording emporium. This is a morning recording which will be followed not too long from now by another cheese and pickle sandwich, and as it's a Friday, I will allow myself some crisps. I've been Rick McAvoy, yes really. Thanks again very much for listening to my small but perfectly formed podcast, it says here, and for giving me 27 minutes of your valuable time. Now, after I've edited out the mistakes and the other bad stuff, this episode is going to be about 23 minutes long, 22, 23 minutes. Thanks for listening, take care, stay safe. Cheers from me, Rick. My brand new course, How to Become a Real Estate Photographer, straight talking advice for beginners to get you making money quickly and build a career, is available to buy now. Find out more at rickmcavoyphotography.com/courses.